A billionaire, suspicious that something strange is happening in his own mansion, decides to secretly disguise himself as a nurse to find out if his longtime maid is really as trustworthy as she seems. He hides his identity, wears a full medical uniform, and returns to his own house pretending to be someone else, all to catch the maid in the act. But just when he thinks he has everything under control and is ready to prove she's been careless with his mother, who lies in a coma, his fiancée walks into the room and does something completely unexpected. Something that makes him stop everything, something he never imagined she'd be capable of doing, especially to the woman who gave him life. What happens next changes everything he thought he knew about the people closest to him. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Coleman managed his business activities, while also taking care of his mother, Margaret, who was in a coma. She stayed in a specially prepared room inside the large family mansion. Richard had a lot of responsibilities, trying to keep his professional life under control, while also making sure his mother received the care she needed. Every day, he checked on her and tried to balance both parts of his life. Helping with Margaret's care was Emily Carter, the housemaid. Emily took her job seriously. She always checked the oxygen machine, kept Margaret's skin clean and moisturized, and read softly to her. She believed it was important that Margaret didn't feel alone. Even though Margaret could not speak or respond, Emily made sure someone was always near. While Richard worked in his office or met clients, Emily stayed close to Margaret. The house remained quiet most of the time, with only the sound of care routines and soft reading in Margaret's room breaking the silence. Victoria Hayes, Richard's fiancée, lived in the mansion as well. She often walked through the house and made comments about Emily's work. Victoria didn't like Emily and always found ways to criticize her. She told Richard that Emily was careless. Sometimes she made up stories about things Emily had done wrong, even though they were not true. Richard didn't question Victoria's words. He believed she only wanted what was best for him and his mother. He trusted her judgment and accepted her complaints without checking the facts. Because of this, Emily started to feel nervous and unsure about everything she did. She knew she was doing her job carefully, but Victoria's words made her feel judged. Victoria often spoke in a quiet, sharp tone that made it difficult for Emily to respond. Even though no mistakes had actually happened, Victoria continued to suggest otherwise, and Richard never asked for proof or listened to Emily's side. The atmosphere in the house began to change. The people who visited Margaret or worked in the house noticed the strange mood between Emily and Victoria. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but the tension was always there. Whenever they were in the same room, there was a feeling of discomfort. Emily tried to stay focused on her tasks, but it was hard to ignore the way Victoria watched her or whispered things to Richard. Other staff members and visitors could see something wasn't right. They didn't say anything, but they felt the pressure too. The once calm and respectful home started to feel different. Conversations became shorter, and people avoided being around when Victoria and Emily were together. Even Richard, although still focused on work and his mother, began to notice the uneasy feelings spreading through the house. Despite the growing tension, Margaret's care continued without pause. Emily never missed a step. She remained loyal to her work and didn't let the situation affect her responsibilities. Every morning, she checked the medical equipment and made sure everything was working. She gently washed Margaret's face, applied lotion to her hands, and sat beside her to read. Her tone was soft, and she chose books Margaret used to like. Emily believed that keeping a voice in the room was helpful, even if Margaret couldn't respond. Richard sometimes looked in and saw Emily doing these things, and he appreciated the calm way she worked. Still, Victoria's constant remarks were starting to create doubts in his mind. He began to observe more closely, trying to find any small mistake, even though he had never noticed one before. Emily felt the change, but stayed quiet, hoping her actions would speak for themselves. As time passed, Richard started noticing small changes in how people in the house behaved. Some of the staff who used to be cheerful and open were now more reserved. They did their jobs and left quickly. It wasn't just because of the workload. It was the feeling of being watched, the sense that any mistake could be reported. Emily, in particular, felt the pressure the most. Richard couldn't ignore it anymore. He started thinking about what Victoria was saying and comparing it with what he saw. Emily had always been dependable, and he had never seen her act with anything but care and attention. But Victoria was convincing. She always had an example, a story, or a warning. Richard found himself stuck between two people he trusted in different ways. He didn't know who to believe, and tried to convince himself that Victoria only wanted to protect him and his mother. Still, the situation didn't change. Victoria continued to drop small comments about Emily's behavior. She never accused her directly in front of others, but she always made sure Richard heard what she thought. She repeated stories about forgotten medications or late checks, but when Richard tried to look into them, he never found proof. Emily kept working the same way she always had. She focused on Margaret and didn't argue or defend herself. She believed that showing her care through her actions was enough. But each day the pressure grew heavier. Victoria seemed satisfied whenever Richard looked unsure. The balance in the house was slowly shifting. Even if Margaret remained still and silent, the world around her was changing. Everyone in the mansion could feel it, but no one knew how to stop it. They continued their routines, but something quiet and heavy had settled over them. Victoria began to act in a more controlling way inside the house. She interrupted Emily's tasks often, even when they were simple and necessary. If Emily was cleaning or preparing something, Victoria would walk in and find a reason to stop her or point out something she didn't like. She made sure Richard noticed these moments. She would speak in a serious tone, saying that Emily was not doing things correctly or paying enough attention. Sometimes she would walk into the room and complain that something was missing or not clean enough. She tried to make it look like Emily didn't know how to do her job well. Emily didn't respond. She stayed quiet and kept doing her work. She followed her usual routine, cleaning the room, checking medications, and keeping things in order. She also prepared simple meals and drinks for the nurses who came daily to care for Margaret. Even though the pressure from Victoria was getting stronger, Emily didn't stop doing what she was supposed to do. Emily kept focusing on her tasks. Every morning, she entered Margaret's room and began the same careful routine. She cleaned surfaces, changed linens, checked the placement of medical supplies, and organized the area so it was easy for the nurses to work. She also made small meals for the medical team, knowing their days were long and busy. She didn't speak much to Victoria and avoided confrontations. Emily believed that if she kept working the right way, Richard would see the truth. But Richard had become more distant. He spent less time talking to Emily and more time listening to Victoria. Victoria often came to him with small complaints. She told him that things in the room were not where they should be, or that Emily had forgotten something important. She showed him fake reports of problems she claimed to notice. Richard didn't know what to think. He wanted to believe that Victoria was just trying to help, but he also remembered how dedicated Emily had always been. Victoria continued with her complaints, and Richard, unsure of what to do, didn't question her. Emily's silence made it easier for Victoria to appear right. She never raised her voice or argued, which made it look like she accepted the criticism, but in truth, she simply didn't want to cause more problems. What bothered Victoria the most was something she couldn't control. Even though Margaret was unconscious, she reacted when Emily was near. When Emily spoke or read softly, Margaret's hands sometimes moved slightly. These movements were small, but they were clear enough to notice. Victoria saw this and didn't like it. It made her uncomfortable. It was as if Margaret responded better to Emily's presence than anyone else's. Victoria didn't mention this directly to Richard, but it added to her frustration. The quiet moments between Margaret and Emily seemed to bother her more than anything Emily did or didn't do in the room. The medical team noticed these changes as well. They observed that Margaret seemed calmer and more responsive when Emily was present. Her facial muscles relaxed a bit, and her hands made small movements when she heard familiar sounds, especially Emily's voice. They discussed it quietly among themselves, but chose not to get involved in the family's personal matters. Their focus was on Margaret's health, and while they noticed the emotional reaction she had to Emily, they didn't bring it up in meetings with Richard. The doctors and nurses did their jobs carefully, and they appreciated the support Emily provided. Her attention to detail made their work easier. Still, they could sense the tension in the house. They avoided commenting on it, but the uneasy atmosphere was clear. They tried to stay focused and professional, even though it was obvious that something wasn't right between the people living in the mansion. Inside the house, everyone felt the change. The tension was growing day by day. Victoria's attitude didn't soften, and Richard continued to drift further away. Emily became more isolated, but she didn't stop caring for Margaret. Her days stayed the same: clean, prepare, check, repeat. She didn't complain. She tried to stay invisible, but Victoria wouldn't allow it. Every small action was watched and judged. Richard, caught between the two women, didn't say much. He didn't defend Emily, but he didn't confront Victoria either. The silence between them created more distance. Margaret remained still in her bed, but her reactions to Emily brought some sense of connection. It was the only thing in the house that felt real and warm, even if it was small. Everything else was filled with quiet tension, silent judgment, and unspoken emotions that no one wanted to face directly. As time went on, the relationships in the house became even more complicated. Trust was fading. Emily worked under pressure. Victoria continued her quiet control, and Richard watched without making any decisions. No one spoke about what was really happening. The nurses did their jobs and avoided personal conversations. They came and went, offering care, but not opinions. Everyone seemed to be pretending that things were normal, but inside, no one felt that way. The house had become a place of careful steps and forced calm. Margaret's room remained the center of attention, but even there, emotions were hidden behind routines. Emily stayed close, doing what she could. Victoria kept pushing her role, and Richard stayed in the middle. There was no open conflict, but the silence between them said everything. Feelings were growing, but no one was ready to talk about them or change anything. So, the days continued, one after another, in a house filled with quiet strain and emotional distance. After several weeks of listening to Victoria's accusations against Emily, Richard finally made a decision. He wanted to understand what was really happening in the house without creating more conflict, so he arranged for small cameras to be installed in different parts of the mansion. He didn't tell anyone the true reason for this. He said it was for general safety, to make sure the house, the people, and the belongings were protected. He spoke calmly and clearly when he explained it to Victoria. He told her that with so many people coming and going, like nurses and visitors, having video surveillance would help everyone feel safer. Victoria agreed and did not question him. Richard did not mention Emily when he talked about the cameras. He made it sound like a normal decision to improve security. He worked with a technician who helped place the cameras in places where they wouldn't be noticed. He wanted everything to look natural and not cause alarm. Emily had no idea that Richard was trying to gather information. She simply continued with her tasks like she always had. Every day, she entered Margaret's room and followed the same steps. She changed the bed sheets, wiped surfaces, and checked the medical equipment. She wrote down notes about Margaret's condition and helped the nurses when they arrived. She answered their questions and stayed close in case they needed something. She also made sure everything was clean and ready for the next shift. She didn't notice anything different in the house, so she kept doing her work with the same attention as always. She didn't ask about the new cameras or mention anything about them. Richard watched her from a distance, trying to stay neutral. He didn't want to make quick judgments. He still remembered everything Victoria had said, but now he wanted to see things for himself. He started checking the video recordings quietly, without telling anyone. Victoria noticed the cameras, and from that moment on, she became more careful. She slowed down and started thinking before she acted or spoke. She still didn't trust Emily, but she realized that she could no longer behave the same way she had before. With the cameras active, she knew any wrong step might be recorded. She didn't stop watching Emily or lose her opinions, but she stopped speaking as freely as before. She avoided making comments in front of others and stopped creating situations that could make Emily look bad. Instead, she began to act more controlled and polite. She kept her distance and tried not to give Richard any reason to doubt her. She didn't complain as much, and she stayed quiet during medical visits. Even though her attitude changed on the surface, her feelings about Emily didn't change. She was just being more cautious now that she knew someone might be watching her behavior. Meanwhile, Richard started reviewing some of the first recordings. He didn't find anything wrong. He saw Emily doing her work with care. She walked calmly, handled items gently, and followed the same routine every day. She spoke respectfully to the nurses and always checked on Margaret. Richard noticed that she was not lazy or distracted. She was focused and professional. Still, even after watching several hours of footage, Richard was not fully convinced. He thought it was still possible that some mistake or careless act might appear later. He didn't want to make a decision too early. He continued collecting recordings and watching them in small parts when he had time. He wanted to be fair, but also wanted to be sure. Even though nothing confirmed Victoria's complaints, he wasn't ready to completely ignore them. He believed the truth would come with time, so he stayed patient and waited for more evidence to appear. Inside the mansion, everything seemed normal. The nurses continued their visits, the medical equipment worked as expected, and the staff kept their routines. Meals were prepared, cleaning was done, and Margaret remained in her quiet room. Richard kept managing his business during the day, spending time in his office and checking on the situation when he could. Emily did her tasks without interruptions, and Victoria stayed quiet most of the time. The cameras didn't cause any visible change in the house's routine. No one talked about them or mentioned feeling uncomfortable. It was as if they weren't there at all. But Richard knew they were working, and he checked them regularly. He tried to find patterns, hoping that with time he would get a clear view of what was really going on. He was no longer relying only on what Victoria told him. He wanted to see the truth for himself, with no influence or pressure from anyone else. The days continued in the same way. Emily showed up early, focused on her duties, and stayed near Margaret whenever needed. She helped keep everything in order and answered questions from the medical team. She didn't complain or act differently, and she didn't seem to know that anything had changed. Victoria kept her distance, not speaking much, and avoiding situations where she might say something that could be used against her. Richard spent more time alone, thinking about the situation and watching the videos when he could. The house remained quiet, and everyone stayed in their roles. But underneath the normal appearance, there was still tension. Richard was still uncertain, still watching. He didn't want to make a mistake. So the cameras kept recording. Everyone did what they had always done. But now every movement, every word, every action was being silently observed. Richard hoped that soon he would finally have the answers he needed. Victoria realized that the cameras installed in the house could ruin her plans. She knew that if Richard kept watching the recordings, he would eventually see that Emily was doing her job correctly. That made her nervous. She wanted Richard to believe that Emily was careless, but now everything was being recorded. So, Victoria decided to change her strategy. Instead of just accusing Emily with words, she began to manipulate the space around Margaret. She moved some objects in the room to make it look like something had gone wrong. She made sure things looked out of place, like medication bottles moved to the wrong side of the table or medical items no longer in the correct order. She didn't stop there. One day, she disconnected part of the monitoring machine, but only slightly, just enough to cause concern. Then, only a few minutes later, she called Richard and said something was wrong. She told him that Emily had not done her work properly and had left everything in a mess. When Richard arrived at Margaret's room, he saw the equipment had been fixed and everything looked normal again. Victoria told him she had walked in earlier and found the room in a bad state, with things moved and a machine not connected correctly. She said Emily was to blame and explained that she had fixed nothing because she wanted him to see the problem himself. Richard didn't argue with her, but he quietly checked the camera footage later. What he saw did not match Victoria's version of the story. The video showed Victoria entering the room first. She stayed inside for a short time and then left quickly. A little while later, Emily entered, moved slowly and calmly, and corrected the equipment without any panic. She also put the bottles back where they belonged. There was no sign that Emily had caused the problem. She was only fixing it. Even with this evidence, Richard was still unsure. He told himself that maybe Emily had made a mistake earlier that was not recorded. Richard tried to understand the situation. He didn't want to accuse anyone unfairly, but he was also confused. Victoria continued to insist that Emily was causing problems on purpose. She said Emily was not just making mistakes, but was actually sabotaging the treatment. She repeated her words often and looked serious every time she brought it up. Richard listened, but the video kept playing in his mind. He saw with his own eyes that Emily had calmly fixed the issue, yet he still felt uncertain. Maybe there was something he didn't see. Maybe Victoria knew more than he did. He didn't take action, but he didn't defend Emily either. He remained quiet and tried to stay neutral, even though things were clearly getting worse. The doubt stayed with him, and he didn't know who to trust. The house felt heavier, and Margaret's room became the center of all this silent conflict. Emily continued working as usual, even with the growing pressure. She didn't change her routine. She cleaned the equipment, checked the machine connections, and made sure Margaret's pillows were placed properly. She didn't ask questions and didn't react when Victoria walked by or made comments. She focused on the patient, doing what she had always done. Her hands moved carefully and her face remained calm, even when things around her felt tense. She knew something wasn't right. She could feel that Victoria was creating problems, but she had no proof and didn't want to make the situation worse. So she stayed quiet and kept her attention on Margaret. The most important thing was to make sure the patient stayed safe. Emily believed that her work would show the truth. If she kept doing everything correctly, Richard would see that she was not at fault. Still, it was not easy. The feeling of being watched and blamed was getting harder to ignore. The tension between Victoria and Emily kept growing. It was present in every part of the day. In the kitchen, during nurse visits, in quiet hallways, wherever they were, the air felt different. They didn't speak directly to each other unless they had to. When they did, the words were short and the tone was cold. Emily tried not to react, but she could feel Victoria's eyes on her all the time. Victoria, on the other hand, stayed alert, watching for any moment she could use against Emily. Every small action was noticed and judged. Even the way Emily folded sheets or placed a cup on the table seemed to carry weight. Richard could see the tension, but he didn't step in. He continued watching from a distance, still hoping that something clear would happen to help him make a decision. But nothing obvious came. Only the same routines, the same silence, and the same slow increase of discomfort that spread through the house. Everyone in the house began to feel the effects of the situation, even if they didn't talk about it. The nurses sensed something was wrong. They saw the way Emily worked hard and remained quiet, and they noticed the way Victoria walked around, always serious, always watching, but they didn't get involved. Their job was to care for Margaret, and they focused on that. Richard kept checking the camera footage, but he still didn't feel sure enough to act. He didn't want to blame Victoria, but he also couldn't forget what he had seen. The cameras showed the truth, but his mind was filled with doubt. Emily, surrounded by suspicion, continued her work with quiet dedication. She didn't ask for support. She didn't explain herself. She simply did her job. Margaret, as always, remained in her silent state, unaware of the tension around her. The house continued to function, but everyone inside felt the weight of a conflict that was still unresolved. Richard informed everyone in the house that he needed to leave for a few days. He said it was an urgent business trip and that he had to take care of some important matters related to his company. He explained that he would be unavailable during that time and asked that things in the house continue as usual. He didn't give many details about the trip. Victoria listened quietly and didn't ask many questions. Emily simply nodded and continued with her duties. What they didn't know was that Richard had other plans. He wasn't just going away for business. He had already made arrangements with a supplier to help him with something he had been planning in secret. Over the past few days, he had contacted someone who could provide him with hospital clothing and an ID badge. His goal was to return to the mansion in disguise. He wanted to observe things more closely, without anyone knowing who he really was. He hoped to finally see the truth without filters. On the night before his supposed trip, Victoria seemed pleased. She acted more relaxed and moved around the mansion with more freedom. She didn't hide her contentment. It was clear that she was satisfied, knowing Richard would not be around. She walked through the halls and took extra time in different areas of the house. She watched the staff more closely than usual. She looked at her watch several times and made mental notes about when people started or finished tasks. Her behavior changed. She looked more confident, like someone who had more control. Emily noticed that the mood in the house felt different, but she didn't know the reason. No one had told her anything besides Richard's short announcement about the trip. She kept her focus on her regular duties. She checked Margaret's medications, replaced sheets, and cleaned the space carefully. She didn't ask questions. She just wanted everything to be ready for the night and for the next day. Victoria continued walking around the house until late. She spent time near Margaret's room but didn't go inside. She stood by doors and listened to footsteps. She moved from one part of the house to another, sometimes quickly, other times slowly. She was paying attention to how often people passed by, who was doing what, and when each task was done. Emily stayed focused on Margaret. She made sure the bed was clean and comfortable. She checked the temperature in the room and adjusted the pillows. She prepared everything so the patient could rest without problems. Emily noticed Victoria walking back and forth, but she didn't stop to ask why. She had learned to stay quiet. Emily didn't want any more trouble, so she continued doing her part, hoping for a peaceful night. Margaret remained still, and Emily sat beside her for a while, reading in a low voice, as she always did. The night felt long, but Emily stayed calm and kept doing her work. Early the next morning, Richard quietly left the mansion. It was still dark outside when he got into his car. He didn't want to draw attention. He drove through a few streets before reaching a faraway parking lot where he had left the clothes and hospital ID hidden. He parked in a quiet corner, stepped out of the car, and changed clothes. He put on the hospital uniform and adjusted the ID badge. He also wore a mask and cap, making sure his face was covered. He checked himself in the mirror to make sure everything looked right. He looked nothing like the person who had left the mansion just an hour before. Now dressed like a nurse, he was ready to go back to the house. He believed this was the only way he could find out what was really happening when people thought he was gone. He didn't want arguments or more confusion. He wanted to see the truth for himself. Richard's plan was to return to the mansion without anyone recognizing him. He knew that if he walked in as himself, people would change their behavior, especially Victoria. But if he came in as a new nurse, one that no one had met before, he could move around without suspicion. He could watch how people acted when they thought he wasn't around. He hoped this plan would help him understand what was really going on between Victoria and Emily. He had seen strange things on the cameras, and he still had doubts. Disguising himself gave him a chance to get closer to the daily routine without being noticed. He believed this was the only way to make a fair judgment. He didn't want to rely on opinions or stories anymore. He wanted to see with his own eyes how people treated each other and how his mother was being cared for. With his disguise complete, he was ready to return to the mansion. While Richard drove back, now in disguise, things inside the mansion continued as usual. Emily didn't know anything about Richard's plan. She followed the same routine she always did. She checked Margaret's breathing, made sure the medical equipment was working, and gave the nurses the supplies they needed. Victoria, still confident that Richard was away, continued walking through the house with a calm and focused expression. She thought she had more control now. She didn't expect that Richard was planning something. No one did. The house was quiet, and everything seemed normal from the outside. But Richard, dressed as a stranger, was already on his way back. He was determined to find answers, and he was prepared to stay hidden for as long as it took. Disguised in the hospital uniform and wearing a mask, Richard returned to the mansion and introduced himself as a temporary nurse sent by the medical team. He gave a different name, and his ID badge matched the story. The staff did not suspect anything. They were used to new nurses coming in occasionally, so no one asked too many questions. Richard kept his voice low and avoided long conversations. His goal was to watch and listen, not to attract attention. When he arrived, Emily was the one who received him at the door. She greeted him politely and offered to show him around. She didn't recognize him at all. She explained that the house had a specific routine and that the patient, Margaret, needed constant observation and quiet care. Richard followed her through the halls, paying close attention to her tone and her attitude. There was no sign of nervousness or tension in her behavior. She was calm, clear, and focused on the work that needed to be done. Emily led Richard to Margaret's room and began to explain everything. She showed him where each item was kept, from the medicine cabinet to the storage drawers for clean linens. She described the schedule for vital sign checks, how to adjust the monitors, and how to speak to the nurses who came during the day. Richard listened carefully, trying to absorb every detail. But more than that, he was watching how Emily behaved. She moved around the room with confidence. She checked the machines gently and made small adjustments without rushing. She spoke to Margaret softly, even though there was no response. It was clear that she believed in keeping the patient company, even in silence. Richard noticed how often she looked at the monitors, how she straightened the blankets, and how she cleaned each surface with care. Nothing felt forced. There were no shortcuts or signs of laziness. Everything she did was part of a steady and thoughtful routine. Victoria's reaction to the new nurse was different. From the moment she saw Richard in disguise, she didn't seem pleased. She did not greet him warmly or welcome him into the routine. Instead, she stayed distant and watched him carefully. She asked short, sharp questions about his experience and background, pretending to be concerned about Margaret's well-being. But Richard could tell she was uncomfortable. Her tone was impatient, and she didn't hide her annoyance. She didn't come near the patient's room unless she had to. When she did, she kept her visits brief. She made comments about how the routine didn't need to be changed and hinted that things were already being handled well. Richard did not respond directly. He acted like any new employee would, polite, quiet, and ready to help. This allowed him to stay close without causing suspicion. He wanted to see how Victoria acted when she thought no one was watching her with suspicion. Her discomfort was becoming more obvious. As the day went on, Richard walked through different parts of the house. He observed the change of shifts between nurses, the way staff moved through the corridors, and how people interacted with one another. He made mental notes of things he had heard from Victoria in the past and began comparing them with what he was seeing now. Many of the claims she had made did not match the behavior he was witnessing. He saw Emily checking records, cleaning medical tools, and staying near Margaret's room. Other staff members treated her with respect and seemed to trust her. No one showed signs of confusion or concern about her work. In contrast, Victoria seemed to grow more tense as the day continued. She didn't like that someone new was there, watching. Her actions became more guarded and her mood less stable. Richard continued to remain quiet and careful, noting every detail. He didn't want to miss anything that could help him understand the truth. The presence of the disguised Richard had a clear effect on the environment in the house. Everyone kept doing their tasks, but the mood shifted. Victoria, who usually walked around with confidence and control, now looked uneasy. She avoided spending time in areas where Richard was present. Her usual complaints became less frequent. She seemed unsure about how much to say or do around the new nurse. On the other hand, Emily stayed focused. She acted the same as always, following the daily routine without hesitation. She didn't seem bothered by the new arrival. She shared information openly, answered questions, and offered help when needed. Her behavior didn't change, and she didn't try to impress anyone. This contrast became clearer to Richard with each hour that passed. One person seemed calm and steady, while the other appeared nervous and guarded. The more he saw, the more he began to understand how the house really functioned when he wasn't around. Richard continued his observations into the evening. He helped with small tasks when needed and stayed close to the routine. He didn't draw attention to himself, and he avoided speaking unless necessary. He wanted to keep his role simple so that he could observe without interference. Watching how the staff worked, how Victoria behaved, and how Emily kept her focus helped him start to form a clearer picture. The house that once felt full of confusion and conflicting stories was beginning to show its true side. The recordings from the cameras had given him part of the story, but being there in person, unrecognized, allowed him to see things in a new way. He could feel the difference in energy between each person. With this new information, he hoped to finally decide what was real and what was not. He didn't say anything yet. He just kept moving quietly through the house, gathering what he needed, one moment at a time. During the afternoon, Victoria began to pay more attention to the staff's behavior around the house. She walked through the halls more often than usual and kept her eyes on what everyone was doing. She especially focused on Emily. Victoria noticed that Emily spent more time with Margaret when there were fewer staff members in the house. This made her uncomfortable. She didn't say anything out loud, but her expression showed that she didn't like what she was seeing. She also noticed that the new nurse, who was actually Richard in disguise, had started interacting with the equipment and moving around more freely. Victoria didn't recognize him, but his presence bothered her. It made her feel like she had less control. She watched him from a distance and seemed annoyed when he stayed near Margaret's room. Meanwhile, Emily continued doing her work without knowing she was being watched so closely. She stayed focused on her responsibilities and kept her attention on what Margaret needed at every moment. Emily spent the afternoon following the usual care routine. She organized all the medications for the next hours, checking labels and doses carefully. She cleaned the room, wiped down surfaces, and made sure everything was in the right place. She also followed the doctor's instructions to do passive exercises with Margaret. These exercises were gentle movements to help keep the patient's muscles active. Emily moved Margaret's arms and legs slowly and carefully, always watching the patient's face for any sign of discomfort. She worked with care and calm, never rushing through the tasks. Richard, still pretending to be a nurse, observed everything. He paid attention to how Emily handled the medications, how she cleaned each item, and how she performed the exercises. He could see that she followed every step exactly as the medical team had explained before. There was no sign of negligence. Emily did everything with precision, and her focus never changed. Richard began to understand how serious and responsible she was. While Emily stayed busy with her tasks, Victoria kept moving through the house with quiet intensity. She didn't talk much to anyone, but she moved quickly through the corridors. She opened doors without knocking, looked inside rooms, and walked away without saying anything. Sometimes she adjusted small things like pillows on a couch or items on a shelf, even when nothing needed fixing. It wasn't clear why she was doing this. She seemed to be looking for something or trying to stay busy. Her behavior made the house feel more tense. Staff members noticed her movements and avoided crossing her path. The usual calm atmosphere was being replaced by silent pressure. People spoke less, and even their footsteps seemed quieter. Despite this tension, the daily tasks continued. The nurses came and went at their scheduled times. Emily stayed on schedule, and Richard remained nearby, watching everything. Victoria didn't stop walking through the house, as if she was trying to keep control of something that was slowly slipping away. Even though the mood was uncomfortable, the basic routine of the house stayed in place. Meals were prepared and delivered on time. The nurses checked Margaret's vital signs regularly. Bandages were changed when needed, and medications were given according to schedule. Emily made sure that all these steps were followed. She didn't let the strange energy in the house affect her work. She wrote down updates in the medical logs, made sure the patient was clean and comfortable, and answered any questions from the staff politely. Richard continued to observe from his position as the new nurse. He helped when asked and made sure to stay close enough to see how things were being done. He took mental notes about everything, how people moved, who said what, and how each part of the day flowed. He was learning more than he ever had from behind the cameras. Being there in person allowed him to see how people really behaved, especially when they thought he wasn't watching. As the afternoon continued, Richard paid close attention to every detail. He watched how Emily double-checked every medicine before giving it to the nurse. He noticed how she kept a steady rhythm throughout the day, never leaving things half done. She stayed patient and kind, even though the environment had become heavy with unspoken tension. Victoria passed by the room several times, each time slower than before, each time glancing inside. She didn't say anything, but it was clear that she didn't like how much time Emily was spending with Margaret, or how calm she looked doing it. Victoria seemed to be waiting for a mistake, something she could point out, but nothing happened. Emily remained focused, and Richard saw no signs of the neglect that Victoria had claimed before. On the contrary, what he saw showed professionalism and commitment. The more he watched, the more confident he became in what he was seeing. Things weren't as Victoria had described them. By the end of the day, the schedule had stayed on track. Margaret had been cared for with attention and consistency. The nurses completed their shifts without problems. Emily finished her tasks with the same discipline she had shown from the start. She checked that everything was clean and ready for the night shift, noted the important information in the logs, and gave the patient one last check before stepping out. Richard stood nearby, still in disguise, and felt a stronger sense of clarity. The tension in the air hadn't gone away. Victoria was still walking around, silent and watchful. But through it all, the work had been done correctly. Richard didn't say anything yet, but what he had seen helped him understand things better. The difference between what had been said and what was real was now becoming more clear. He just needed more time to keep watching, to be completely sure before making his next move. At the beginning of the evening, the atmosphere in the mansion became quieter as the daytime activity started to slow down. Lights were dimmed in some parts of the house, and fewer voices were heard in the hallways. During this time, Victoria entered Margaret's room. Emily had stepped away briefly to get cleaning supplies from the storage area. Victoria walked in slowly and stood near the bed, staring at Margaret, who lay still and silent as always. Her expression was unreadable, but it was clear she was deep in thought. She stayed there for a few minutes without saying anything. Margaret didn't react, remaining unconscious as she had been for weeks. Victoria continued watching her closely, taking slow steps around the room. She touched the corner of a table and glanced at the medical equipment. Her body language showed control and discomfort at the same time. Meanwhile, outside in the hallway, Richard stood silently. Still disguised as the temporary nurse, he kept his distance but was positioned to see who came and went. He didn't want to miss anything. A few minutes later, Emily returned to the room, holding the supplies she had gone to collect. When she saw Victoria inside, she kept her tone calm and respectful. She didn't question why Victoria was there. Instead, she offered a soft greeting and went back to her tasks. Emily wiped down surfaces and checked the positions of items around the bed. She tried to keep the mood light, but Victoria did not respond kindly. Instead, she started making negative comments again. She pointed out small things in the room and spoke in a sharp voice about how certain items were placed. She questioned whether the bed had been cleaned properly and suggested that the patient was not receiving the attention she needed. Emily didn't argue. She continued her work in silence, keeping her focus on Margaret and avoiding eye contact. These kinds of remarks had become common, and Emily had learned not to respond. She just kept moving, doing her job. Richard, still playing the role of a nurse, entered the room shortly after. He walked over to the monitor and checked Margaret's heart rate, which was steady. Then he took her temperature, made sure the cables were connected correctly, and updated the patient chart. His actions were smooth and professional. He said nothing personal. He kept the conversation strictly about the patient's condition. Victoria stood nearby, watching every move he made. Her eyes followed his hands closely. She didn't hide her irritation. She crossed her arms and tapped her fingers against her side, clearly showing that she was annoyed with his presence, but she didn't ask him to leave. She remained quiet, but visibly uncomfortable. Emily continued adjusting the bedding and refilled the water on the side table. There was tension in the room, but no one said anything directly. Every person focused on a task, but the silence was heavy. Richard noticed how uncomfortable Victoria became with him there. As the minutes passed, the house began to settle into its nighttime routine. Most of the staff had already finished their tasks for the day and moved back to their assigned areas. The hallways, once filled with movement and quiet conversations, were now mostly empty. Only a few lights remained on, mostly near the patient's room. The air felt heavier with fewer people around. The activity level had dropped, and the stillness in the house made every sound stand out more. Footsteps were softer. Doors opened more slowly. Voices were kept low. It was clear that the house had entered a more reserved and serious stage of the day. Richard, still in disguise, stayed near the room. He didn't leave, choosing to stay close and continue watching the interactions. He knew this was when people let their guard down. He wanted to see how everyone acted when the house was quiet and there were fewer eyes around. That's when true behavior often appeared. Victoria remained in the room longer than usual. She didn't speak much after her initial comments. She simply stayed nearby, standing in the corner or sitting for a few minutes before standing again. She looked uncomfortable, but she also didn't want to leave. It was clear she was trying to maintain control over the situation, even though she didn't speak to Emily or the nurse anymore. She glanced at the machines and at Margaret, but didn't touch anything. Her presence seemed more about showing authority than participating in any care. Emily continued working in silence. She checked Margaret's position, gently adjusted her arms, and made sure her clothes were not bunched or twisted. She did everything with steady movements. Richard kept observing, watching how Emily remained focused even under pressure. He could see how hard she worked to avoid conflict, even when Victoria's eyes were constantly on her. The atmosphere in the room stayed tense, but Emily's actions were calm and consistent. Eventually, the rest of the house became completely still. The kitchen had closed, the cleaning staff had returned to their areas, and most of the house lights were turned off. Only the light inside Margaret's room and a few hallway lamps remained on. The main floor was nearly silent. Few people were still awake or working, and all attention was now on the patient's care. Richard stayed near the doorway, quietly reviewing the machines and taking quick notes. Emily sat for a few minutes next to Margaret, speaking in a low voice as part of her routine. Victoria finally stepped out of the room but didn't go far. She remained nearby, standing in the hallway and checking her phone. The space outside the room felt heavier with each passing moment. Richard kept his role, watching everything without reacting. The evening had revealed more of what he needed to see. How Emily worked, how Victoria behaved when no one was supposed to be watching, and how the house truly functioned in silence. The house had become extremely quiet. Most of the staff were already in their rooms or had left for the night. The lights were dimmed in the hallways, and the main floor had little to no movement. Margaret's room remained softly lit, and everything inside was in order. The machines were running normally, and the patient lay still as usual. During this silence, Victoria returned to the room. She opened the door slowly and stepped inside. Her eyes moved directly to the bed. She looked around briefly, making sure no one was nearby. In her hand, she held a pillow. She walked quietly across the room, stopping beside Margaret's bed. She stared at the woman lying there, completely unresponsive. Then she looked at the position of Margaret's head and the machines. She seemed to be thinking, measuring her steps. She didn't speak, and her face didn't show emotion. At that moment, the entire house was unaware of her presence in the room, and everything seemed frozen in silence. Emily had been just outside, organizing some materials she had used earlier for cleaning. She noticed that the door to Margaret's room was open again and saw Victoria inside, standing unusually close to the bed. Something about the scene looked wrong. Emily acted quickly. She rushed into the room and saw the pillow in Victoria's hands. Without waiting, she stepped forward and pulled the pillow away. Her voice was firm, asking what Victoria was doing. Victoria didn't answer clearly. Instead, she stepped back, holding her ground. The two women began to raise their voices. The tension that had been growing for weeks exploded in that moment. They moved around the bed, speaking loudly, their voices breaking the silence of the house. Margaret, still in a critical state, remained unresponsive, unaware of what was happening around her. The medical machines stayed active, beeping softly. The disagreement between Emily and Victoria escalated quickly, each woman trying to take control of the situation while standing on opposite sides of the patient's bed. Their argument grew louder, and their movements became more intense. Emily tried to explain what she had seen, her voice filled with urgency. Victoria kept denying, saying Emily misunderstood the situation. Neither of them backed down. They both moved around the bed, keeping a close eye on each other. Emily stood protectively near Margaret, holding the pillow tightly, not letting Victoria near it again. The room, usually calm and quiet, had become filled with noise and stress. The tension that had been silent for so long had finally turned into something visible and loud. At that exact moment, Richard, still dressed in his disguise, was nearby in the hallway. He had heard the raised voices and immediately rushed toward the room. When he entered, he saw Emily pulling the pillow away and standing in front of Margaret. Victoria looked shocked and took a step back as soon as she saw him. She didn't speak. Her body froze and her face changed. She knew someone had witnessed the moment. Richard didn't say anything right away. He looked at the scene in front of him. Margaret was still lying in bed, motionless. Emily stood close to her, breathing heavily, holding the pillow. Victoria had moved to the side, now visibly nervous. Richard scanned the room, taking in every detail, the machines, the positions of the women, the tension still in the air. His mind was processing quickly. He had seen what mattered. There was no longer any confusion. The cameras had shown many things, but this moment was something different. It was happening right in front of him. The truth was no longer hidden. The sound of the argument and the raised voices had also reached others in the house. Within minutes, footsteps were heard in the hallway, getting closer. The medical team, alerted by the noise, entered the room quickly. They went straight to Margaret, checking her vital signs and making sure everything was stable. The staff acted fast, focused only on the patient's condition. The doctors and nurses moved around the bed, checking monitors, touching Margaret's wrist to find a pulse, and adjusting the oxygen mask slightly. One of the nurses took notes while another prepared new readings. The tension in the room shifted again, now focused on the patient's safety. Emily stepped aside to let them work, her eyes still watching Victoria carefully. Victoria didn't move much. She stayed quiet and avoided making eye contact. She knew the presence of the staff changed everything. The moment of conflict was no longer private. The staff didn't ask questions about the argument. Their priority was the patient, but their expressions showed concern. They could feel something serious had just taken place. Richard stayed near the door, still in his role as the nurse. He didn't reveal anything yet, but his thoughts were clear. He had seen more than enough. The reactions, the actions, and the sudden panic had confirmed many things he had been unsure about until now. After the team finished their checks, they confirmed that Margaret's condition remained stable, with no signs of immediate harm. Her heart rate, breathing, and temperature were within expected limits for her condition. One of the doctors said a few quiet words, asking everyone to stay calm and leave space for the patient to rest. Emily nodded and moved to the side, placing the pillow back in its place properly. Victoria stayed silent, not responding. The medical team began leaving the room one by one, returning to their other duties, though their eyes lingered on the people in the room a little longer than usual. Once the room was less crowded again, the silence returned, but it was no longer peaceful. The air was heavy, filled with unspoken words. Richard, still in disguise, stood still, watching everything. He knew the time for pretending was almost over. What had just happened was serious, and it had changed everything that had led up to this moment. After everything that happened during the tense night, Richard knew it was time to stop hiding. The situation had reached a point where he could no longer continue with the disguise. Standing inside Margaret's room, with Emily nearby and Victoria still silent, he took off his mask and cap, revealing his identity to everyone present. The reaction was immediate. Emily looked surprised, not understanding how the nurse she had been working beside was actually Richard. Victoria's face changed completely. Her expression turned from nervous to shocked. She didn't speak. Richard didn't waste time. He told them clearly that he had seen enough and that everything was recorded. He explained that he had installed cameras weeks earlier and that he had already reviewed the footage. He played key moments, showing Emily caring for Margaret with dedication and professionalism. The recordings also showed Victoria's strange actions, especially the most recent ones. There was no room left for doubt. The truth had been fully exposed, and Richard was no longer confused. Once the evidence was shown, Richard made a firm decision. Victoria was to leave the mansion immediately. He didn't argue, and he didn't give her time to defend herself. He asked security to escort her out and made sure she didn't return. Private security staff were also given clear instructions to write down and report any unusual activity from that point on. Every entry, exit, and visitor would be registered with complete detail. Richard wanted full control of the situation. The safety of his mother was now his only priority. Victoria didn't resist much. She knew the recordings spoke for themselves. Without saying much, she left the property under the supervision of the guards. The house was quiet again, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a feeling of relief mixed with the weight of everything that had happened. Richard turned his attention back to his mother and to Emily, who had stayed by Margaret's side during everything. Emily, although surprised by what had just happened, quickly returned to her usual role. She didn't stop to talk about the incident. Instead, she began reorganizing the equipment around the patient's bed. She checked every wire and reconnected each monitor to make sure nothing was out of place. She cleaned the table surfaces again and refilled the supplies the medical team used most often. She remained calm and professional, even with everything that had just happened. The doctors and nurses worked together with her to stabilize Margaret's vital signs, which had shown slight changes due to the earlier tension. Richard watched as Emily continued her work without hesitation. Her focus was still on the patient. She didn't ask questions or try to justify herself. She simply did her job. That quiet dedication was exactly what Richard had seen in the recordings. He finally felt sure of who he could trust. His decision to wear a disguise had led him to the truth, and now, actions spoke louder than anything else. While the medical team worked, Richard took time to review documents related to the house. He wanted to be sure that no other risks were being ignored. He went over employee records, schedules, and past complaints. He also spoke with the staff individually, asking if they had seen or heard anything suspicious over the past weeks. Everyone was honest and detailed. Several people confirmed that Emily had always been respectful and careful in her work. Some had even felt uncomfortable with Victoria's behavior, but had not known what to do about it. Richard listened to every testimony and wrote down notes. He wanted to be sure that the situation was fully understood. He didn't want to overlook anything. It was important to him that the house return to a safe and organized place. He had made the mistake of trusting the wrong person once, and he didn't want to repeat it. From that point on, he was going to keep a closer watch on everything. After completing the internal review, Richard contacted the local police. He believed it was necessary to have a formal record of what had occurred. He explained the situation over the phone, and officers were sent to the mansion. When they arrived, they were taken to a private room, where Richard gave his full statement. He also showed them the recordings that supported what had happened. Emily, still working in the patient's room, was later asked to give her version of events as well. The officers asked clear and professional questions. They also spoke to the nurses and security guards. Everything was documented properly. The police confirmed that the information would be included in an official report. No arrests were made at that time, but the incident was now part of a formal investigation. Richard wanted everything to be handled legally and with full transparency. It was no longer just a private family issue. It had become something that needed to be addressed with proper procedures and oversight. Over the next several days, things in the mansion slowly returned to normal. The medical routine settled back into its regular pattern. Nurses arrived and left on schedule, and Margaret continued receiving care without interruption. Emily remained responsible for her tasks, and her presence brought a sense of calm to the house. Richard reinforced protocols with all the staff. Every procedure, from cleaning to medication delivery, was now checked and double-checked. New rules were introduced to improve communication among employees, and security was increased. Cameras remained in place, not to create fear, but to make sure nothing was left to chance. Richard also spent more time at home, staying closer to his mother and watching the progress personally. The tension that had once filled the halls was gone. In its place was a quiet focus and a shared goal, keeping Margaret safe. The events of the past would not be forgotten, but now the house was moving forward, stronger and more aware than before. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Now that you've finished watching this incredible story, click on my profile picture and access my videos. I'm sure you'll be enchanted by all the good stories about justice and kindness. Enjoy. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.